Welcome to our webinar on improving rural resilience to disasters, examples from research and practice. My name is Corianne Scally, and I lead research on housing, community, and economic development at Community Science. My work focuses on reducing disparities between places and populations, including in rural areas. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Curlin and Dontarius, who are here today assisting with the webinar and questions and answers. We hope you will take away several key learnings today, including how to pay attention to specific needs of diverse rural populations, including families, youth, and people with disabilities. We hope you'll learn some strategies for proactive, inclusive planning in rural communities to strengthen disaster response and recovery. And we'll focus in on some key areas like housing, small water systems, and engaging people with disabilities and youth. And we also hope that you'll leave with a better understanding of the need for trauma informed recovery to build community resilience. Helping communities recover and heal is a critical part of this process as well. I am joined today by Daniel Elkin, who is the Director of Policy Impact and Innovation at CDCB, or Come Dream, Come Build, which is a multifaceted affordable housing organization devoted to utilizing collaborative partnerships to create sustainable communities across the Rio Grande Valley through quality education, model financing, efficient home design, and superior construction. He's responsible for initiating CDCB's research initiatives and advocates on behalf of policies that expand homeownership at the local, state, and federal level. In addition, Daniel coordinates CDCB's resource development and data collection efforts, and we're really pleased to have him with us today on our panel. I also have Brandy Gilbert, my colleague, who is a senior associate here at Community Science. Brandy brings expertise in researching topics and evaluating initiatives related to community resilience, especially efforts that build community capacity to respond to natural disasters. She also has extensive experience working with youth to build their capacity to lead change in their communities. At Community Science, we work with philanthropy, government, nonprofits, and grassroots organizations to help them strategize, research, and evaluate initiatives that result in healthy, just, and equitable communities. In our equitable community development practice, our work promotes opportunity, thriving, and resilience for people and the places where they live, work, and play. Our goal is to support systemic changes that ensure a fair future by strengthening community capacity and supporting place based solutions that are fair and accessible, support human thriving, and build resilience to adversity. Before the panel starts, I'd like to provide some basic framing for our conversation. Rural communities are at risk for climate and weather related disasters. For example, we see here that rural counties across the Southeast and Southwest are particularly likely to experience extreme heat. On this next slide, we see that many rural counties are exposed to flood risk as well, and not just in coastal areas, as we might assume. And for this last map, we also see that wildfire risk is particularly high for rural counties in the western half of the country. Rural communities that face these increased risks have certain vulnerabilities and have fewer resources to prepare, respond, and recover from these disasters. We might find fewer staff and systems in place for planning an emergency response. They may have large land areas and long distances between places that can make response and recovery challenging. Many small communities have one road in and out of town, which certainly problematizes evacuations and getting to respond and recover in these communities. Infrastructure is also often aging in many rural communities and may not be adequately maintained, which is can be critical to really weathering disasters as they occur and recovering quickly. And we also know that older mobile homes, which is a prevalent housing type in some rural communities, are particularly ill equipped to weather these types of climate emergencies and disasters. However, there is a silver lining in that we are learning that things from small tweaks to larger modifications in policies and practices can improve rural resiliency to extreme weather events and climate disasters. And our panel today, we really look forward to highlighting some examples of what works for building greater rural resilience to disasters. So now we're going to move into our panel, and I'm really pleased to converse with Daniel first. Um, Daniel, feel free to unmute yourself. Welcome to the panel.
Yes, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here with us. So CDCB does a lot of what you call recovery work around disasters. Can you describe the types of disasters you've seen kind of hit the communities that you work with in South Texas, and how that's informed and shape your pre-recovery work in the rural communities you work with?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're here on the Gulf Coast, here in Brownsville, Texas, as far south of Texas as you can go. So primarily, we've had hurricanes that have impacted our community off and on for the past few years. Probably the one that informed our work on recovery the most was Hurricane Dolly in July of 2008, which was not necessarily a direct hit on our community, but the subsequent flooding from where it did make landfall was absolutely disastrous. Most of Cameron County, the county that we were in, you had large sections that were underwater, major flooding event. And so we really learned from that some of the hard lessons that I think a lot of communities have learned about recovery, which is that process after the initial response where you are trying to rebuild your community in many respects. This is where we saw what I think many people are now familiar with FEMA trailers, trying to house people in these temporary situations, trying to get the money flowing so that you can start to kind of rebuild your housing stock or other social services, and it just not really working. Certainly not working for our community and some of the unique aspects that make up who we are. In some cases, FEMA funding did not reach people until 10 years after Hurricane Dolly. So we kind of sat back as a housing organization and said, there's got to be a better way to do this. There has to be something that we can do ahead of time to kind of pre-cover, is the term that we like to use, so that we have a plan ready to go. So we'll get into some of those particulars, I think, in a minute there, Quinn, but I wanted to just cover, we actually worked with the state of Texas, the state government, the government land office here, as well as FEMA, to come up with some pre-recovery planning methods that actually will help kind of green light. So that way, when a disaster hits, hey, we've got pre-recovery planning ready to go. And it gets that money moving faster and gets the process moving faster and just kind of increases your capacity. So that's where really kind of the genesis of where our thinking started and why and how we got there.
That's great. And I know we received some questions at registration from folks wondering about things like getting states involved in this process. So we'll look forward to hearing more from you, maybe particularly during the Q&A. I know that housing is a core strategy for CDCB, right? It's really key to what you do with the communities you work with. Can you describe the Rapido model that you have developed and that you're now using with communities, in terms of how it relates to increasing that upfront preparedness you referred to, as well as really helps to speed up recovery post-disaster?
Yeah, absolutely. So Rapido was really the culmination of everything that we had learned, the negative experience that we had post Dolly. And what it is really, like I said, that pre-recovery planning process. And the things that are really important, again, after a disaster, it's almost impossible to do these things. And it's things like data collection, knowing where the social vulnerability is in your community so that you know where you need to get help. And yearly and environmental reviews. Those are things that if you don't already have those up to date when a disaster hits, there's certainly no way that you're going to be able to do those in real time and trying to respond and recover afterwards. So really just putting it on local municipalities or local counties to start to do that work beforehand and really making sure that it's done in a way that's thinking forward. The other thing that I would say, more than just, okay, we've got the data, we've got social vulnerability mapped out as far as where the communities are going to need the most help the quickest. The other essential part is pre-procurement. Going out and getting the contracts in place with local vendors and keeping them updated with local service providers. So that way, when disaster strikes, you already have contracts in place to bring those people back to do the work that needs done in the recovery period. So this can be something like building materials, as large kind of major capital intensive items as that, or more importantly, is really just some of the services. So one of the things that we try to map out in our pre-planning process is like a navigator, because that's one of the things that once people are trying to figure out how to repair their homes and go through that process, it's extremely confusing. It's extremely complex. The rules are all over the place. So making sure that you have a team of trained people that can step back in as soon as the disaster is over and you get to that recovery part, that can navigate people through that. So that's one of the things that we try to pre-procure. Pre-procure sites, intake sites, so that people can come and bring in their applications, bring in the things that they need to find out more information. One of the things we learned in Dolly is that when you have a disaster that strikes your housing stock, it's really what FEMA does to determine the damage and thus determine where funding is going to go to kind of replace a house or repair a house, is they bring in outside contractors from all over the country to come in and actually do individual inspections. Again, they're not necessarily from this community. And so even though they come and they try to do their best, a lot of times, we're right on the border. Most of our population speaks Spanish. So you're getting a lot of contractors from other parts of the country that don't speak the language. And then they're trying to explain to people, well, this is why I assessed your house this way. So either working to have local populations that can do that, or having social navigators that can at least kind of connect the dots for them. And the other thing I would add on that is, the FEMA trailers, which I think has become this almost kind of thing that everyone understands post-disaster, is these terrible situations. What typically happens there is that's supposed to be temporary housing. And that temporary housing is supposed to eventually transition to the repaired housing stock, and then people move into that. But of course, that repaired or new housing stock never really happens. And so they end up stuck in the FEMA trailers for a much longer period of time than was ever anticipated. And then there's a time where those FEMA trailers are going to literally be taken away because you've hit the wall as far as how long the FEMA's going to fund those. The Rapido model, what we use locally here through CDCB is volumetric modular housing to deploy a temporary home within like 2 weeks after the disaster. We can get a temporary home in place that people can live in, that's going to be right on the site of where their previous house was, if it's cleared out of the way and we can get them in. And then over time, we can transition that volumetric modular home that was temporarily constructed for temporary purposes, I should say. We can convert that into the eventual permanent home within 90 days. So it's a much quicker turnaround. We were able to work with the state and the GLO office to actually make sure that FEMA funding was okay with that it could at first fund that temporary dwelling, but then transition also then into the permanent home. And so that's one way to really cut down the timeline. Again, people get to move back to their neighborhood next to their neighbors and the people they know. They're not in some kind of FEMA trailer camp. And these are all little ways. I would say if I could sum it up in one thematic piece, it's really that you're giving back a sense of local control. right? You have where the local government has pre-procured these items, pre-procured this expertise so that it's ready to respond and it's ready to say how things should work. And it's not necessarily a top-down or an outsider perspective telling you how to do those things. And so that local control piece is so important to us for Rapido. Rapido has its own website for those that are interested. I'll make sure to put that in the chat, and of course, happy to answer questions or go into more details as needed, Corianne. But that's it in sum.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And again, I, appreciate hearing about working with the community and multiple levels of government to get these systems set up in advance of disaster striking. And really love those examples. So thanks so much for sharing. And yeah, I'll definitely will circle back with more questions on the planning type of planning you do and the housing model and response models that you're using. We are going to shift now to a different area of vulnerability. Um, Hopefully, I heard some strong connections already with what Daniel has shared um, about his work in South Texas and the work of CDCB. So it's always great to see synergies across learning, across places and disasters. So I led case study research on two rural communities that also happened to be in South Texas that were affected by a deep freeze in the winter of 2021. And in speaking with the water system managers, the operators of these systems, the board members that come from the community, and the customers from these systems, we found some particular areas of vulnerability, um, including whether the water pipes are above ground or buried in terms of whether they freeze and whether they're exposed to the elements. Also, whether an electronic monitoring system is in place to detect water levels and leaks on a regular basis, and then how these might be affected by power outages, which was the primary issue during the 2021 event. Whether backup generators are present at all, and then at all system facilities. This was a vulnerability across both systems that we spoke with. How far apart the system facilities are from one another, which affects the ability of staff to actually access sites far away, particularly under a deep freeze condition where the roads were iced over. And in terms of regular processes, how well performing and maintained the system is prior to disaster striking, the existing processes in place for reaching customers in an emergency, which I think ties in a bit to some of what Daniel was speaking about as well. And then also an overall shortage of trained local staff and contractors that are available for that response. So Daniel, another great connection in terms of understanding the local capacity to respond quickly and thinking about getting some structures set up in place. Uh, in terms of solutions, working with our community research partner, Communities Unlimited, we identified a number of ways to improve disaster preparedness for these small community water systems in the future. This includes supporting ongoing system maintenance through low-cost capital and grants to the smallest systems. Often they have a hard time competing for existing resources. And it also includes helping low-income customers afford to pay their water bills so that systems can actually charge the rates that they need in order to afford to adequately maintain their infrastructure and their level of service. All water systems should also have an emergency preparedness and response plan. I think that is going to come through loud and clear across our panel. And this is even if they fall below the required population size, which, in case you're interested, is 3,300 people served by the system. And on this slide here, you see an example of the types of information that should be included in a comprehensive emergency response plan for water systems. And finally, there are places to go to receive technical assistance for emergency preparedness planning. Communities just need to know how to access it. A good starting point is to look up the RCAP agency, or the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, that works with rural communities to specifically build the capacity of small water systems and wastewater systems and help them plan in advance for disasters. There are other places to turn as well, but these are a good starting point. When preparing for disasters, it is also important to consider the needs of all community members. This includes those who have disabilities and may rely on electricity, for example, for life saving devices and medications. They may need help evacuating, and they may face unique recovery needs as well. Unfortunately, rural residents with disabilities can be invisible and are undersupported in disaster planning, response, and recovery. And while rural communities have higher rates of people living with disabilities than the nation as a whole, these communities often lack adequate support services and infrastructure for the diverse disabled population in general. And then, in the case of emergency planning and management, these communities often have even less capacity to meet the needs of this population. Many rural communities also struggle to meet basic obligations of non discrimination in service delivery, transportation, and public accommodations for disabled people following disasters. We found that state and local agencies who are responsible for emergency management may not understand federal mandates for non discrimination during disasters and can fail to meet their legal obligations as a result of simply not being clear on what they are. And finally, the research that I'm describing uh, included a scan of available major federal programs that support disaster planning, response, and recovery, and found that very few, if any, programs focus specifically on rural areas or specifically on people with disability and ensuring that their needs are met in all phases of disaster planning through recovery. So, based on the program scan we conducted and interviews with a variety of experts on disability, including those with lived experience with disabilities, disaster experts, folks in emergency management, and also experts in rural development, um, we identified several ways to support more disability forward processes in this space. This includes prioritizing and partnering with disabled people in climate and disaster planning, recognizing that people with disabilities have very specialized knowledge and their own direct experience that is vital to ensuring equitable disaster planning. These individuals can fill key partnership and leadership positions in these processes, from serving in advisory roles to being hired directly as staff in the emergency planning and management space. Other lessons include tailoring to local rural contexts and needs, such as providing alternative portable energy sources in case of power outages. So, losing power, as I mentioned, can really be a life or death situation for people with disabilities. And we did find cases of places that were trying to think ahead and making sure that folks had backups on hand, not just generators to power their home, but in the event of evacuation, making sure that they had energy sources to take with them. Other strategies include strengthening disability forward critical infrastructure in rural communities, like existing human services, like existing public transportation systems, or ensuring there is some coordinated transportation option, particularly for evacuation of people with disabilities. Um, Oftentimes, this is missing in rural spaces. Also, improving government agency coordination at the national, state, and local levels, and increasing investments in climate and disaster planning. Again, we found some really interesting examples of how this could be done if it's not already being done. And Daniel's also already discussed that important role of coordination in advance as well. And finally, um, we also noted the need to improve disability and disaster data to highlight rural vulnerabilities as well as successes. Oftentimes, it can be challenging to drill down to a specific rural community from public data to really assess needs and understand how communities are doing. You often need to tap in to that local knowledge to make sure that you're understanding, as Daniel discussed, the specific vulnerabilities facing that community. Um, and, one example that we were given was the fact that whomever is responsible for local emergency management, those are usually residents in the communities, and they actually know the folks who live in that place, and they know where the older adults live. They know where people with mobility impairments live. They know where youth live. They know where all of the vulnerable people live in the community already, and just being able to tap into and mobilize that data for planning purposes can be really critical and just not something that's always done in advance. So we're going to turn now to speak with Brandy.
Great.
It's great to have you, Brandy. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So a lot of your work has focused on youth leadership and engagement, and you have some really specific experiences working with youth recovering from disasters, which I'm really excited about learning from. Why is it important to consider the effects of disasters on youth?
Yeah, I definitely want to get to your question. Also, some things that both you and Daniel were sharing had me percolating. I have tons of notes and just thinking about a trend that I really am hearing in our conversation that's relevant to my remarks is that context matters. And, there's the rural, suburban, urban, and all the things in between. And in the rural context, something that I've seen not only in working with youth, but also, as Corinne, you mentioned, thinking about federal programs. Like I was also involved in my past work in a large scale study looking at CDBG-DR. So looking at block grants that focus on disaster recovery in all types of communities, really. And what you commonly see in the rural communities is that you're having funding sometimes that surpasses what organizations and local entities may have had. So the budgets could be even larger for one year than what has gone through in the past. So it's so robust, sort of what you need to kind of pass through that funding. And that's one end. And then the other end you're seeing is disasters that aren't getting that level of funding. So what some organizations like Margaret A. Cargill has focused on, thinking about those low attention disasters, which are happening a lot in the Midwest, where they're going on and they may not even be making the news. They may have a federal declaration attached to them with funding, or they may not. And so you're thinking about like the larger context that rural communities are operating in. And our conversations also making me think about the balance of resilience and vulnerability. Just in the having disaster research background, there's always this pendulum swinging about like people are strong, they can hold it. No, there's more need for support. And we always keep finding in the research that the balance is really in the middle of like, yes, there's both things at the same time, and that it might look different in the rural context compared to some others. So to your original question about thinking about young people in the context of rural disasters, there's so much we could talk about. But one thing I really wanted to point to is the role of uncertainty in some of the work that I've done in the past following the 2010 BP oil spill in communities like in Bayou Battery, Alabama. Like you said, having one main road leading in, one or two stoplights, super small, especially then, is the role of uncertainty. In that case, it was a technological disaster having an oil spill. And speaking with young people, when I say young people, I mean usually teens and sometimes young adults, but doing work, especially that focus on middle school and high schoolers, was seeing that so much uncertainty of not knowing. When would the water open back up? When could we return to normalcy? Is it safe to eat seafood? Is it safe to breathe the air here? What are the health impacts on me and my family? So there's just so much happening on top of what Daniel was saying is other disasters where you have like relocation and those things. It's a different beast, but kind of unfolding in a rural place. And something that I found really interesting is young people's connection to the water. And so teenagers had their own boats. They were operating them by themselves. They were fishing, just being out there sort of recreating. And one young person said, like, it took a piece of me. Like that's how they described the BP oil spill. But at the same time, it was a disaster where not that many people were talking to young people. They were talking about all the news was about the health impacts, the economic impacts. Some people termed the BP oil spill like the money spill, because also it had all of these, like BP was sort of coming in and laying all of these resources, but kind of back to something that Daniel was sharing is like how those resources channeled and with even with things like pre-recovery. I love that term. It's like who is a part of pre-recovery and recovery and who is not. Who are the loud voices? Who are the quiet voices? And just seeing young people often left out of the pre-recovery and the recovery voices. So something that I wanted to share.
Thank you so much. And thanks for yeah, for just helping to connect the dots. So, again, and show the convergence in some of our messages today as a panel. Kind of looking at the recovery side.
Yeah.
I know you've had the opportunity to work with youth to really help expose kind of the trauma that you've already been describing. Based on your research, what are some of the best practices that you have found for supporting youth after disasters, and with an eye towards um, improving, I don't know if shortening recovery time is the right word, but improving their recovery time and improving health, and how it goes on to affect the rest of their lives.
Yeah, I would say one thing is I like to think not only under the disaster brand, which I have called myself a disaster researcher in the past, but I've backed more into like a resilience framework and not in the buzzword because it's had a lot of frameworks. But what I really like about it is that resilience takes into account both chronic and acute stressors. So disasters on the acute side, and then the chronic is thinking about things like food insecurity, housing instability, economic instability. And so one thing is recognizing what young people and their families may already be dealing with before a disaster and like what happens when chronic stress meets acute stress. It's like on top of uncertainty and all of those things, everything that you have going on. And that's what some of our current work really teaches me is like having young people involved in addressing all of those stressors. And then in terms of recovery, I mean, shortening, yes, it's a little strong. I think recognizing that it's going to be going on in long term. To me, you can say all these lessons to me, they're textbook, but something that my recent work has really pointed to me is how quiet some of the strongest work is. And I would say around building social capital, social emotional supports, and how the more and more I talk to nonprofits and continue to build those relationships and how they talk about how they build with young people, which I like to say is relentless. It is always showing up, always being there, no matter what time, having support teams, passing relationships, sharing transferable trust. And what I found in our work about lots of different things is that we're constantly looking for like those markers, like how many young people got jobs, how many young people are in this recovery camp, like all of those things, which some people call like the outputs. But to me, the real work and the work that we really have challenges tracking is like getting under there. So how do you build that safe space? How do you recognize in a rural community that it might not be the typical one? And even, you have schools, churches, those things, but I even mean like it might not be those things either, like just being at somebody's house. And so how do you tap into informal structures that are actually the things that are driving communities and like where young people feel safe? And then the second one, there are lots here, but the second one I'll just highlight is empowering youth to be a part of, lead, or even just be a part of recovery, is that often those are the voices that are left out. And what I love about the age that I was talking about is like it's really that younger to older adolescent age. And that's the age where your brain is developing, your stances are developing about this world. And so you definitely have a say, even if somebody is not asking you. And they are, like, especially people who are on the younger end of adolescence, they're not too far from like the future adults and people who are inheriting this world. So to me, just pushing into that agency pendulum, respecting vulnerability too, but like what are the things that young people could be doing in both the pre-recovery and recovery? And there's lots of research about, you know, being part of how a community is rebuilt, making sure that those trust centers are there, being a part of peer supports. There's just so many stories of how young people are helping to drive and support recovery in a safe way.
I think something kind of coming through loud and clear to me from our panel is the importance of relationships, of local relationships, local trust, being there before, being present before disaster strikes, and really working to have those local relationships in place. Um, just seems like a really important aspect of that pre-recovery process, or that planning process that we're all working, discussing, that, of course, extends beyond disasters. We happen to be talking about disasters today, but, I think in rural spaces, especially, that trust and those relationships, and that kind of community civic infrastructure is just really important, to build, on the ground, every day. So I appreciate that coming through, kind of what we're sharing.
I would just add to that, Corianne,
Please.
and also that like that is the work. Because sometimes
Mhm.
people are thinking like it's the agreement, it's the house, it's the whatever unit is like at the end of all those relationships, and that's the work. And sometimes people also don't want to like invest in what it takes to build that work.
Yeah, and it takes time. And it takes place-based organizations like CDCB and others that, have a commitment to work with particular communities over time, and to really cultivate those types of relationships and trust. Before we turn to audience questions, I'd like to just pose one question for the three of us to consider. We're all data geeks. We believe in the power of data and research to help us see important information, to help us, as Brandy, you were talking about, context matters. So to help us kind of establish the context within which we're working, and also measure impacts over time. Um, what is one area where you believe new data or research could help us improve rural disaster resiliency? So one area, new data or research, if you could pick anything that you think would really strengthen rural disaster resiliency, in this space that you work in, what would that be?
Want to go first, Daniel?
Sure. Yeah. I think, well, for us, we work in South Texas. And so what I have to say again I think it ties into what we're talking about, context matters. Here in South Texas, we have a lot of communities that are known as colonias. And so colonias, for those that don't know, are unincorporated areas, often politically unrepresented, and they're neighborhoods that really are lacking in infrastructure, whether it's water, usually water, sidewalks, drainage. I mean, all of the basic amenities, and the housing stock is usually pretty poor. So to answer your question, Corey, and one of the things that when we're trying to initiate some local planning with local communities, is really kind of an updated mapping and an updated understanding of the quantity of colonias with a kind of scaled measurement of where they are in their development process, because some have moved forward and gotten drainage, street lights, things that we kind of typically tie with subdivisions or communities. Some have not. Some are all the way on the other extreme and lack every single amenity imaginable, including even running water in some cases. And so really a modern definition and a modern mapping and locating of these communities. Because again, when a disaster hits, if you're trying to identify who needs the help the quickest, having that data set in front of us, being able to say, hey, we know that these colonias are here and this is what they don't have even before the disaster, that would be something that would absolutely change the game for us. Now, I know that's very specific and unique to our region, but I think it plays to our overall theme of that context.
Yeah, absolutely. Brandy?
I'm gonna sneak in a top three just because I have so many ideas percolating, but I'll be fast.
Go
So
for it.
one is like more models on youth agency that are safe, comprehensive, can be taken to different places, including rural, like where young people are driving, pre-recovery and recovery and all the things. Two is generally just more long-term work. We constantly see sort of the harping on response, recovery, but we know so many disasters are there for a long time. And three is the focus I mentioned earlier on more smaller, mid-range, like those low attention disasters that have big impacts, often for rural communities. It's my top three hit list.
Hmm. Do you want to define low attention a bit more, just in case
Yeah.
there are folks in the audience less familiar with that?
Yeah, so it's often those disasters, like I had mentioned, they may have well, also there are different ways to sort of define it. The way that I think of it is those disasters that may have a declaration or they may not, but they're often in like a smaller scale language area. They're not getting sort of that traditional news attention. They might also be hitting smaller areas where, like we talked about, the infrastructure is a little bit less robust. So you're seeing those large amounts of funding that could come in that haven't been seen before, or you're seeing not enough resources because it's not even so clear always like what a big impact something can have, even if it's a small scale disaster, because of the magnitude of the area and like all the impacts that something could have. I don't know, Daniel, if it seems like this also touches your work, if you had things to add there.
Well, one thing I wanted to really touch on, Brandon, because it struck me when you were talking about the acute versus chronic, and I think this
Hmm.
also ties into just being there and doing the work, is so we developed Rapido, which is this housing deployment model for disaster. But one of the things, and perhaps we were naive when we first started out, but one of the things that hit us afterwards was we don't need to wait for a hurricane for this. There are housing shortages and housing production issues in all of a lot of rural areas, especially the ones we're working in. And so we actually made that now a main line of business is how to deploy volumetric modular housing into these communities that need it at an affordable price to help upgrade the housing stock, to build resiliency on the front end. Because again,
Yeah.
if we can get the housing stock a little bit better, then that resiliency when the disaster hits is going to pay off. And so I just was struck by that because that's exactly
Yeah.
what we learned kind of on the back end. We don't need a hurricane. We have stuff to respond to now.
Yeah, and we all do. I mean, all communities are dealing with things. It just looks different wherever you are, for sure.
Hmm. I think that's a great note to end on, really, that while we're, talking about disasters, a lot of these ideas really translate into kind of what good community planning looks like for rural areas, especially. And it also ties into, I think what I would raise as an opportunity for new data or research. The existing national scale data on rural areas is just so insufficient for really understanding rural realities. I've been banging this drum for a few years. I would just love to see our capacity in that area really evolve as a country, to value rural places enough to have better data nationally, but also on the flip side to really leverage that local knowledge. Again, that I've already referred to, and Daniel and Brandy have talked about as well, to really just figure out, good ways of, systematically tapping into valuable local rural knowledge, to build, greater community resilience to all kinds of all kinds of events, to disasters, but also, Brandy, to some of those other kind of community level traumatic histories and events that can happen. So I'll end on that and turn things over to Don Terrius to focus on some audience questions.
Yes. Thank you for allowing me to bring my voice into the space. Thank you to everyone that has watched this webinar. And we do have a few questions. And I will say some of the questions have been answered, but I'll just reiterate them or regurgitate them out again. So we have one that says, so the rural population tends to be aging. With the aging population, there are more disabilities. Rural communities are generally losing populations and tax bases, people power, including local funds and staff, declining as a result. So FEMA and state agencies demands extensive plans to be for eligible grants, post-disaster programs. Can you please talk about that relation to systematic change and disaster response? Hopefully that makes sense.
Just a quick housekeeping note for everyone that they could open up the Q&A queue, right? And they can see everything that you're sharing with us too.
Yes.
I mean, I'm happy to get started. I guess I think we tend to overgeneralize rural places and see them as very specific demographic and population. And realistically, they're very different across the country. Some places, actually, the places I think experiencing the most aging actually aren't necessarily the places that have the highest level of disability, for example. And then there are some very young and growing rural communities as well. So I would just kind of call that out as, again, context matters. So, state governments particularly should be kind of zeroed in on the diverse types of rural communities that they have in them and make sure that that they're working with those communities appropriately to plan and respond to disasters. I'm not sure if that quite answers the question, but it's so. But really, that's just a piece of advice to just make sure we're being, really specific about the types of places that we're talking about when we talk about rural communities and their needs for disaster planning, response, and recovery.
Yeah, and just to add, I think some color to that, Corianne, here in South Texas, we have a lot of small metros and then a lot of rural communities around that, but it is one of the fastest growing areas in the United States. And we actually have really young populations, even in some of our more rural communities. And the problem we're running into now is that as some of those smaller metros grow, rural communities are losing what would be their kind of federal rural designation, but they very much still have rural developmental liabilities or concerns. And so,
and capacities, maybe.
In capacities, yes, exactly. And so now all of a sudden it's like, well, that's urban. And it's like, again, I could take and drive any of you around and you see like this under no way would you visually say is urban. And it doesn't, to your point, have that capacity. And so then it makes planning and it makes securing funding a whole new set of challenges because these definitions are not accurate or reflective.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's move on to another question.
Yeah, and Brandy, we have a question for you pertaining around youth leadership and youth engagement. So basically, the question is, how do you engage youth and how do you engage and involve youth in rural communities and small towns after they lose their young people after high school, so post-graduation?
Yeah, and I saw this question and nod to like the number of young people is going down in some rural communities. And I would say thinking about who's there, like sometimes we assume because a voice is small that it doesn't exist, even if it's like people of various abilities, like what Corianne was talking about. And also the second, so considering that, like who is there? What are the voices that are there? What are the age brackets? So if it's like it's not high school, but you have a lot of younger kids and they're having exposure too, and that looks a little bit different to engage young people or younger children. And so who is there? What are the voices? And then also, kind of like Daniel was talking about, like, what are the neighboring areas too? So every disaster I've ever worked on, there's usually like, even if it's not getting a lot of attention, there's like, oh, this is the focus. But then there's always people on the perimeter that are saying like, what about us? It's happening here too. They might work there, but they live here, or vice versa. So thinking about like, what are those areas surrounding too, where you likely are having the impact, and then the number of young people might look a little bit different, or also your larger population might look different if you're thinking sort of like more big picture, main area and surrounding areas. And especially in rural communities, like there's so much connection, even recognizing that the next place might be, that's populous might be really close, or it might be a little bit farther, but the ties might be strong. Everybody's working here and living there, like that example that I gave. And thank you. I do think that's an important point also for Steve and Matt who shared that. Thank you for bringing that up.
And I love the ability to see that the building of that civic engagement of youth, while they're still in those developmental years, as as a critical input to sustaining and building, the future of rural places as well. Because I think, as the stronger our attachment to a place is, the more likely we may be there to want to. Let me try that again. Getting tongue-tied. The more likely we could be to staying there, continuing to invest, um, in a community for the long term as well. So I love that idea of, engaging folks while they're young and showing them that um, they can have agency in their community, and they can, be a leader, is really important in rural contexts as well.
And Daniel, we have a question for you. Someone said, well, first, how do you spell colonius? And can you just talk a little bit more about that concept?
Absolutely. So Colonia is Colonia, Colonia. In Mexico, that's usually used as a description of a neighborhood or a subdivision. That's a colonia. Here on this side of the border, it is really unincorporated communities, meaning that the local municipality doesn't claim them. And so they fall into the kind of jurisdiction of the county, although often counties don't really have the capacity to really do a whole lot for them. They're usually places where immigrant populations had kind of first came to America, was part of the agricultural workforce, and built their homes. And so really from scratch a lot of the times, right? Just families coming together and building homes. And so what you have oftentimes, especially in the 1990s, things have changed recently, but in the 90s, you would have entire communities that would not have connections to utilities like electricity, water. You wouldn't have paved roads. You would not have really kind of any zoning, obviously, or design of the community. And so there are hundreds of those such communities, really thousands in all of the United States, hundreds here in South Texas. And so these are places that have major developmental challenges. And so CDCB has been involved since the 90s to try to help meet those communities where they are in terms of improving their housing stock, making sure that they're getting those connections to social services. These communities are extremely prone to disaster issues, as you can imagine, specifically around flooding, because usually whatever they have created in their community for water, to get water to their communities, flooding is going to disrupt that because it's not your kind of traditional system. And so those are, I think, major hurdles or obstacles that are unique to this area. Last thing I'll say is you also end up some really interesting political situations with that. So just to give you a quick example, the city of Brownsville, as it grew, it actually grew around what is the largest colonia in the United States, which is Cameron Park. And so if you look at the map of the city of Brownsville, it just has a giant donut in the middle, which is this community called Cameron Park. And the reason that the city never annexed it or took it in was because it's a colonia with a lot of developmental issues. And the city simply did not want to have to be on the line or on the hook, so to speak, to fix some of these. And so these communities are, like I said, dotted all throughout South Texas. And so hopefully that gives you some idea of what a colonia is.
Thank you for that, Daniel. And then I'll give this last question to Brandy. So it's regarding the social emotional needs of youth during the disasters. So given the importance of the relationship building, given the importance of relationship building as a fundamental component, what strategies have you seen to be to succeed in meeting demographics where they are during those disasters?
The strategies to meeting, can you say it one more time?
So I guess like what effective strategies have you seen for supporting social emotional needs
Okay.
during, yeah.
Yes. So one, it's not going to blow you away. It's meeting basic needs first. Just the whole idea that we can't sort of get into social emotional safety if we don't have our needs met, which is why all the, the preparedness, the mitigation, all those things are important. So meeting young people where they are, if you're not able to meet basic needs, drawing on what rural communities are often good at doing is making that connection, warm handoffs, making sure you're helping and not just like making the handoff, but literally warm. And so that you are helping to like, hey, here's so-and-so, physically introducing or giving a call, that kind of thing. Third, just showing up. I mean, that's what we see. Donterius and I, we work together on lots of youth programs. Like, how many times do people tell us, like, it's literally showing up over and over and over again? Would say that's the biggest thing. And same what I was sharing earlier, it's like recognizing that that's part of the work. It's also part of what can take the work a long time, because sometimes it could feel like, oh, all we're doing is talking. Well, actually, that's feeling safe. So just recognizing that sometimes it might not seem like you're doing much if you're building those, but you are.
Thank you so much, Donterius. I think, are we good on the questions?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll pass it back to you for the close.
Wonderful. So I just want to first start by just thanking Daniel and Brandy for being part of this panel today. I've really enjoyed the conversation with you all. Or just all giving virtual claps for joining us. I want to thank the audience for joining us today. We have been recording this and it will be posted so that you can refer back to it if you need. We would also always love to support you all in understanding the issues that are facing your communities and regions, rural, urban, suburban, and helping to identify community-driven solutions. My contact information is here. Please don't hesitate to reach out with any follow-up questions or needs. And I think that's it. So one more virtual round of applause for our panelists, and also for Curlin for wonderful slide management, and Donterius for our Q&A time. Definitely takes a team effort. Thanks all, and enjoy the rest of your day.